Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Deep Cuts of Horror, the horror podcast that cuts deeper. I'm Dylan, and I'm joined today again by my co-host Jacob. And we would like to remind you that if you enjoy this podcast, or if you're new here and you listen to the episode and you're going to enjoy what you hear, go ahead, leave us a 5-star review if you enjoy it. Go ahead and subscribe as well, and follow us and like us, and maybe even leave a comment if that's available for you. All right, so today we're going to be talking about 1992's Candyman. Jacob, what's kind of your knowledge about the Candyman? Just kind of going into this movie, because this was the first time I saw it, and I actually had to watch it twice because I didn't get the movie that I thought I did.
So this is not the first time that I've seen this film, but it might as well be because the last time was probably more than 15 years ago, and I only remembered it in very small snippets. I remembered what the Candyman looked like, who is, of course, played by Tony Todd, which you may also recognize from Final Destination. And I remembered the scene with the shrine to Candyman that has all of the little candies with razor blades in them. And I remembered something to do with bees. And that was basically it. So for practical purposes, this could be considered my first viewing. And I definitely agree with you about needing to watch it again. Normally, when we have a film on the list for this podcast, I try to watch it twice before we record. I did not get a chance to do that this time, and I really feel like this is the sort of film where you would want to have a second watching. Like, it's probably as much as Carnival and the Ninth Configuration. This is something that needs to be seen twice in order to fully appreciate.
Especially because this movie is on the list of a lot of popular slashers. And as terrible as slashers were in the late 80s, early 90s, I was expecting a much more lowbrow film. And I was expecting this Candyman figure to be, I don't know, more akin to maybe a Freddy Krueger with some jokes, or hell, even Leprechaun and Chucky by this point were just so outlandishly goofy. And they were just kind of dominating the landscape. Even Friday the 13th and Halloween were doing really goofy things at this time. And this movie played it straight. And honestly, I don't know if I could really consider it a slasher or not. Where do you stand?
So, the biggest takeaway that I've had about horror since we've begun doing these reviews is that I no longer know what the horror genre even is. Because every time we find a movie that I really like, I'm like, is it really horror or is it something else? And so if you're asking about the slasher film, I kind of feel the same way. I don't think there's a reasonable argument that it isn't a slasher film because it involves, in this case, a supernatural entity that goes around killing people with a rusty hook hand. And that's sort of exactly the sort of thing that you would expect to get from a slasher film. It's really the structure of the narrative and the completely straight, very erudite way that the Candyman is played that makes this movie feel unique. And that's as much a product of the way the other slasher films were handling it as it is the way this film handled it. Because if the landscape of the genre at the time hadn't been this goofy, ridiculous nonsense, then this movie wouldn't have stood out as much as it did.
And this movie, I think, plays on it a little bit in the opening scene. That felt more apropos to the type of film I was expecting. And by the time I got to the end of the movie, I don't want to say I was disappointed, because I wasn't. It was just one of those things. I got something completely different than what I thought I was going into. I really don't feel like the hype around this movie does it any justice.
So what do you mean by the hype around this movie? Is this movie very hyped? And if so, why does it not do it justice? Do you think this movie is better than the hype, or that it's different?
Well, when I say hype, it's usually lumped together with a lot of other really popular mainstays in the genre, and I feel like this one is just a little bit more different. Especially, it gets roped in with a lot of other slasher movies, which I feel like is very unfair. Because I know you can search for meaning in all these movies, and God knows we do search for meaning in all these movies, but this one seems a lot more intentional. We're not just trying to sort apart the author's intent or their perspective that they put into the film. This movie is a lot more trying to say something instead of just make a mindless little hack and slash. And part of that, I believe, is because of Clive Barker, who I just realized is a really damn good horror writer. You know, some fans are going to come for me about that, but all I really know him from is Hellraiser. But I read part of The Forbidden, and it reads very well. Like, it is a very compelling, very and not in the way people like Stephen King are, where it's how do I put it? Not necessarily dumbed down, but it's very more written for the everyman. Clive Barker writes in a very elevated kind of way that I don't really believe people write anymore, at least in the last 100 years. It's actually really incredible.
So that I would consider that to be a glowing review, and for me, watching this film again slash for the first time made me want to read the book, because it says at the beginning that it's based on a book, and you always have to take that with a grain of salt. But when I was done watching this, I thought, this sounds like a great book. And maybe it's my turn to put a target on my back, but I have never really appreciated Stephen King's writing style. Um, it is just so low to the ground, and it has just this sort of onanistic quality to it, where it feels like he just sat down and started pounding things out, like, oh baby, the smell of barbecue on the summer breeze, you wouldn't believe it. I'm like, that's not prose, mate. So yeah, like if this has that more elevated style, then I think I would really enjoy it. And you mentioned that this film is trying to say something. I know what you mean by that, but I do want to clarify, because I think a lot of times when we say that a film is trying to say something, it's moralizing. It's trying to talk about racism or poverty, or you know, recently we've had a film about the sex trafficking industry. Those are films that I would definitely say are trying to say something, an inconvenient truth. This film, to me, it's just about something, which, to be honest, is not true of a lot of traditional horror movies. Like, again, Nightmare on Elm Street, it's just a dude killing a bunch of kids. Candyman is about myth and legend and belief and folklore, and sort of like the stories that make the world bigger. And I think that that's really. Um, I don't want to sit here and talk for too long, but I think that's one of the things that I like most about the genre, period, is I like when it makes the world feel bigger. These stories about, like, being out in the woods in the dead of night, or hearing your loved ones calling to you from the grave, or whatever it is, they make the world feel bigger. And we live in a time where the world is probably smaller than it's ever been. And so I really, really appreciated this film for that reason.
I agree. I like stories that make the world feel a lot bigger. And I feel like that's why I'm drawn to these movies from this time period, because there's so much disconnection. If you had cell phones, 90% of the time they didn't work. And you just had all these different explorations of places that were commonplace, but now this person is somehow on the outside of that, or trying to find their way on the outside of it. And like the one of the big settings here, Cabrini Green, it's something that all these people in Chicago, and it was a real neighborhood, by the way, people drive by every day. Now the main character, Helen Lyle, finds her way in the middle of it, and she's got to kind of find her way out. But even when she's on the out, she's still thinking about it. So she's kind of still in it. And I believe it's not without note in mentioning that this movie is very heavily adapted from its source material, in that Clive Barker, he is British. So this movie was, well, the original story was a lot more about class and class poverty in a European neighborhood, very similar to Cabrini Green.
It was set in Liverpool, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So, but here in America, you can't really tell as much of a story about class struggle because we really don't have that sort of ideology with our community. It's more because over there they still have people who marry certain people because it's just what you do. It's good breeding, it preserves the line. It's a lot of almost royal family influence, because they have that whole thing about good breeding, preserving the line, all that manners, and things that make a good family. Not being here, we're a lot more emotionally driven, I believe, in America. Like, if you're a good family, you help others, you do all this wonderful stuff. But over there, if you're a good family, your kid goes to all the right schools, you're a part of all the right social gatherings, and you have at least five forks on your dinner table, for one person to use.
I mean, I don't want to turn this into a manifesto, but we absolutely do have that over here as well. It's just that I think a lot of people are too distracted to notice it. Like, we slash the media slash whoever you want to talk about try to make everything about race and sex and sexuality and XYZ, but we absolutely have a class system. It's an extraordinarily apparent thing once you actually start interacting with people who have money.
Oh yeah, but ours is a lot more. You can pin it down on something besides a couple of very well-to-do families. Like, for God's sake, the Kardashians. Everybody is probably the most famous family in America.
Yeah, I bet they don't use lemon forks.
Yeah, I don't think they use lemon forks either, but the things that they're famous for wouldn't necessarily be what would make them the world's most, well, the nation's most prominent family, in another country. Maybe infamous, and yeah, you can say they're infamous over here, but everybody knows who they are. Millions of people aspire to be them for some reason. Just how they are as people, that makes them. It's just more about what they do, um, and what they aspire to be, than necessarily a set, strict regimen of this is what a proper family should do.
Well, yeah, but they're not a proper family. They're a wealthy family, and there is a difference there. I mean, like true power, true wealth, old money is quiet. Power is quiet. You're not going to want to be in the spotlight because that's dangerous. Like you don't want to be a Kardashian if you have the option. Like, I'm sure that might be better in comparison to a lot of people's situations, but it's not the ideal.
Oh, yeah, no, but I will give them the fact that they have monetized as much as they can of their situation. And I can respect that.
But back to Candyman though. Talking about,
Kardashian coverage.
yeah, I like how, because the world feels so much bigger, which I think there's another reason that happens that I won't get into just yet. Maybe I will later. Because the world feels so much bigger, it makes everything that the characters do an adventure. Like the first half of this movie, all of the horror is derived essentially from being in the projects, which is not really something you would expect from a slasher film. But you have Helen and Bernadette trying to go to this fairly underdeveloped neighborhood. There's graffiti everywhere. It's run by gangs. You just get the feeling that you're not safe. And genuinely, like the first almost 50% of the movie, that's what's scary about it, is just the idea that if you go to this place, you might get lost, or you might get attacked, robbed, raped, what have you. And because of just the way that it's shot and the time period that it's in, going to this neighborhood almost gives you the same vibes as something like Frodo going to the Barrow Downs. Like, that's as much of an adventure as it feels like, at least to me. Does that make
I'll
sense?
agree. Oh yeah, and I've seen a lot of movies based on urban myth, but I feel like this one really captured it where it does feel like an urban fable. Because you can akin going to Cabrini Green and going to this housing project network. It has the same feeling as when a character in a fable goes into a thick wood uh, all alone. And just the mystery that surrounds that and all the dangers that lurk around every corner. It's a very good similarity that you can pull from that.
I think the music does a lot to help instill that vibe as well, because I'm not the sort of person that can describe music particularly well, so I apologize if this isn't accurate, but the score for this film seems to be a sort of synthesized, almost carnival or circus like music that constantly plays over these overhead shots of cityscapes. And it really feels like it's saying, the world is a circus, or the city is a circus, and these are the attractions that we bring to it. I don't know, maybe I'm looking into that too much, but I appreciated that element as well.
And that was another thing that I missed in this movie was just how much the music plays into what we see. You have this very ominous choral music that's played on synth, and it's so much different than any other music at the time in a horror movie, especially a slasher. Uh, and even though it does have that sort of jubilant kind of carnival sound to it, it's still very clean and it's still very almost ethereal in the way it comes across. So it's almost disorienting listening to, and then seeing all these scenes of these dirty walls and graffiti and broken windows and boarded up houses. It's very it creates a really good atmosphere.
I hate that I'm about to use this word because I consider Netflix tags to be a joke. It's always like cerebral, whimsical, poignant. But the way that I would describe the music is cerebral. Like, it's inviting you to think about what you're seeing and to imagine it for yourself.
The music itself too also is very foreboding, like there's something around the corner. And again, I just can't stress how different this movie is from other movies of its time. I clocked it. Candyman doesn't actually show up until 45 minutes into the movie, almost halfway through. And it's just wild. I mean, and there's some scenes in the beginning where we have his voiceover, but I kind of feel like that was tacked on just because there is no Candyman for 45 minutes in the movie, and they needed something to invest the audience because this movie has like a hell of a build up that it does before the story actually gets rolling.
And that makes it very unique, although I'm not entirely certain that it's a good thing, because this movie does feel very much like it's divided in half. Like, there's a before Candyman and there's an after Candyman, and to me those feel like almost separate films. He's not entirely absent from the first half. Like you said, we do get the voiceover, which I didn't feel tacked on. To me, it felt like the sort of general intro to a novel type voiceover, like, in my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice, etc., etc. And then we do see him very briefly in the intro sequence whenever Helen is hearing or telling the story, um, about Billy and the girl that was about to sleep with him, and then she gets killed. But the flash is so quick that it's really impossible to gather any information from it. Like, he flickers on screen for just a split second. So yeah, functionally he is out of the movie for the first half. And to me it's almost like you get to a point in the middle of the film where you feel like you took a nap for a couple minutes and you woke up and you're like, "Oh my word, what's happening?"
The movie just kind of, and that's kind of how the writing does too. It lulls you into this weird state, and then suddenly things just start going off the rails.
It's the garage scene, at least for me. Like the garage scene is the definitive marker, the transition between the first half to the second half, because you have the discussion about folklore and legend, the investigation of the projects, the crime, and then that garage scene hits where we properly see and hear Candyman for the first time talking with Helen, and she sort of gets hypnotized, and from there all the way through the end, like everything is just cranked up to 11 and it's nonstop.
Oh, yeah. Well, we should probably get into that. Do we want to move on to the summary for some of the people who may not have seen the movie?
Yeah, let's go for it.
So, when Helen Lyle, a graduate student writing her thesis on urban legends, discovers the one about a mysterious figure known as Candyman, she finds herself getting closer and closer to danger. It isn't long until myth and reality blur together and the threat becomes personal. But anyway, as we kind of touched on earlier, the first little bit of this movie meets my expectation of what I thought this was going to be. You have the quintessential horny teenagers who are doing something stupid. You know, you got the blonde character who is just doing the thing that nobody should do. You know, you hear the myth about Candyman saying his name 5 times in a mirror and he appears, and then she just goes ahead and does it. And you're like, okay, this is exactly the movie I thought it was. But then it's complete and total. I don't want to say fake out because it is built into the story, but it is a misdirect versus the rest of the movie we get. And then we kind of get this exposition of Helen and her friend who are graduate students and kind of what their life is like. And I found it interesting that this is the character point of view that we're getting. What were your thoughts kind of on the opening scenes?
There's a couple things there. There's a discussion of the opening sequence where we're hearing the story of the Candyman, and then there's also the comment that you made about the perspective that we got and you being surprised by that. But before I answer, could you elaborate a little more on what you meant by the perspective?
Well, I'll say for, you know, slasher movie or any movie, having the perspective be from a graduate student performing a thesis, it lends itself to a much more not necessarily investigative, but an investigative amateur eye. You know, they don't really know what to look for, they're just looking for something. And that lends itself very well. And also with academia, there's a good feeling about whatever bit of research you're doing. You're perhaps a bit you're a bit above it. Like there's like a barrier there. There's you and there's your subject that you're covering. And I think that's also a really interesting contrast about how that line kind of blurs as well.
Yeah, so having recently gotten my graduate degree and am now moving into academia as a profession, I have to say I am extraordinarily jealous of all of the people in these horror movies that are doing theses on haunted houses and ghost stories and different elements of, I guess, paranormal psychology, because I have never gotten even close to anything like that, nor have I seen anything like that. And it would be wonderful if that sort of thing was a bit more mainstream, though I don't suspect it's very profitable. Thinking back to the intro sequence with the urban legend, it really does feel exactly like an urban legend, like the hook on the door or the high beam story. Some of those being from the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, and so I don't feel like it's as disconnected from the film as it might otherwise appear if you didn't think about it in the context of an urban legend. But when you compare it to other slashers and you realize, like, okay, the first 5 minutes of this film are basically the summation of entire slasher movies, where you just have dumb, horny teenagers being brutally killed. I'm glad that we got that over with quickly and got to move into something more interesting. And in terms of the investigatory elements of a graduate student conducting this kind of research, I think that this might be one of my favorite setups for a horror movie because it's so much more interesting than when bad things just happen to the characters. Like when you have a character who happens to move into a haunted house or who happens to be the child of some people who did some bad things in their youth or what have you, then the horror is just sort of thrust upon them and they have to react to it. And that's very situational. It's sort of like the writing advice that I heard, I think, from South Park, which is that your plot should always be connected by but, not and. You want things to be complications and consequences, not just a string of actions. And because you have characters who are actively seeking out the horrifying thing, it's so much more interesting. They are poking the bee's nest. And it would be very easy to moralize that and say, oh, well, that means they deserve it, because they're being stupid. They're going out and looking for the horrifying thing. Uh, but that's not true. Like, that's something that as humans, you have to do. You have to cross the ocean and discover new territories. You have to go out and fight the dragon. You have to go check on the bump in the night and make sure that your family is safe. You have to go poke the bee's nest at some point. And so the question becomes, well, what happens once you do? And I really love that you have a character who is going out of her way to visit these dangerous places and to learn about this dangerous story, even to the point of facing physical threats to her person because she's dedicated to the research that she's pursuing. Similar with Joyce in Rose Red. I think these two characters honestly are a bit more similar than I realized until beginning this sentence.
Yeah, I do that too. When I start talking, the brain's working, or not working, and I come to a conclusion. But yeah, I was sitting here thinking about what you said. Joyce and Helen are very similar, in that they're both doing these projects. One perspective of it is they get so consumed with it that it starts causing other people very real personal harm. And it gets to be one of those things they just shake it so hard till the cat comes out of the bag, and then they don't know how to put the cat back in the bag.
I don't know how much we want to get into this right now, but let me know if you find this an interesting line of thought. I think that for the people who have an obsessive desire to be quirky and read into things more deeply than those things deserve, there is an interpretation of this film that says Candyman isn't real and Helen actually just went crazy. And I think that the information that we are presented doesn't support that. But if the film had been changed just the tiniest bit, then that could have been a really excellent uh, element of ambiguity to add. And I even have like an entire bulleted list of the things that could have been made slightly different in this film to give it a completely different meaning. And I think that even though I really did like this film, it could have been a classic. Like this could have been a great piece of work with just a few changes.
I think one of the things I enjoy about it, to kind of go off that, is I enjoy how you kind of get two movies for the price of one. Um, and reading it either way, you can read it either way. And much like urban legends, there's going to be variation, and there's going to be different circumstances, but the story's still pretty much the same. You have a woman who goes to Cabrini Green, things happen, people are dead, and then she is burned alive. Spoiler alert. but that is the basis, and it's pretty cool how this movie gives you all these different points of contact to where you can see their side. Like you can see Helen's side, you can see the psychiatrist side, Trevor's side, all these people's side of the story, and it's a completely different perspective. And you don't even have to reach to say, oh, I wonder what this character thinks about this, because they do communicate that, I believe, very well in the story. The residents of Cabrini Green, their side of it. And it's just like an urban legend. And when you get to the truth of the matter, um, and that's kind of the whole thesis of this movie, is the truth really doesn't matter. All that matters is the legend and the myth that is left behind.
That's pretty much the ethos of the character of the Candyman. In the intro sequence, you have the story of the two characters who said Candyman's name 5 times. And here you see Candyman kill the girl. But that very easily could have just been a story. It could have been made up, it could have been part of the urban myth. Then, after Candyman hypnotizes Helen, she wakes up in a pool of blood, dead dog, and then she has an altercation with the lady who lives in that residence. That very easily could have really been Helen's doing. Like maybe she became obsessed with the idea of Candyman, or she just started going a little bit crazy, and she actually did kill that dog and kidnap the child. And when you have Candyman appearing in the apartment and killing Bernadette, was that her name? The friend?
I believe so, yes.
It's something like that. That once again legitimately could have been Helen's doing. It's only, and even when we get into the psychiatric hospital, we look at the footage of Helen on the table in restraints, and she sees Candyman, but nobody else sees him, and the footage doesn't pick him up. So once again, it's all in her head. It's only when we get to the scene between her and the doctor, when she is restrained and Candyman kills the doctor and cuts her restraints and breaks the window, that it starts to drift away from the idea that possibly this is all just in Helen's head. Like you can still make the argument that the doctor let her out of the restraints and she's just imagining her own version of the events, but I think that's a bit too much of a stretch. And then you have to deal with the whole baby being in the pyre and all of that. So I think that if you just made those few changes, and then at the very end, when Trevor dies, make his cause of death razor blade cuts to the wrist. Razor blades like were in the candies at the altar of Candyman. Because then you could interpret that as Trevor being simply racked by guilt or grief and killing himself. And so for the entirety of the movie, this idea of Candyman and this story of Candyman and this haunting voice and this narrative about myth and urban legend is dominating the film. But at the end of the day, you can say that that's all it was. It was a myth. And these were actually just actions taken by people who were crazy or stricken with grief. And I think that that would have been such an amazing element to add to the story on top of what we already got.
I don't know necessarily about changes per se. Um, I feel like I read the ending of The Forbidden, and the ending was a bit different. I'd have to revisit it. But I something in me does like how it pins it on, oh, what's her name, side chick, Trevor's side chick. Namely because she said she was gonna go make a salad, and then she gets out this giant hunk of skirt steak and just starts hacking away at it with this knife. Um, Let me tell you, I've never seen someone so inept at using a knife, period. But I do like the implication of Helen implicating her in this crime as well.
Yes, that is definitely possible that Helen would be implicating the girlfriend. And just for the record, I'm glad you at least noticed that it was a skirt steak because I thought it was ground beef. And so that scene played even weirder for me. I was like, why is this lady going to town on this ground beef with a knife that big? You can just pull it apart, sweetheart.
Well,
But
yeah,
but
but
yeah,
no, it was just a whole pet peeve moment where she's just like bringing that thing down as hard as possible on the skirt stake, stopping what she's doing, taking the little strip she cut off and flinging it into a pan behind her. Ugh.
culinary horror. Can't get enough of it. One of the things that I probably like the least about this film is the fact that it relies so heavily on the idea of the characters being framed. And this is something that you see very often in horror films because what happens is you have these supernatural, or at least apparently supernatural crimes that are being committed, and you have to answer the question of how do the law enforcement agencies respond. And sometimes you can get around this by just having law enforcement be unavailable. But if you're in a city like this, it's not like the police are just going to ignore these brutal murders. And so, what usually ends up happening is that one of the main characters or one of the side characters gets framed for the crimes of the slasher that the audience knows they didn't actually commit. And ambiguity aside as to whether or not Helen is crazy, that's pretty much what happens in this film. Helen gets framed for the murders of Candyman. And to be completely honest, I just really hate framing plots. Like I think there's usually not a lot of depth to them. They don't tend to go anywhere, and they're just not very interesting. I would consider them to be the horror movie equivalent of the love triangle trope. And I just generally think that anytime you want to do a framing plot, there's almost always a better thing that you could be doing. And in this case, I think that better thing would be to leave the audience in limbo as to whether or not Helen really did the thing. So that was probably, if I had one major complaint, that would be it, is I don't like the whole framing element.
I'll agree with you. However, I'll say this movie does it miles above other movies that I've seen. And I believe part of that is the ambiguity of, is Candyman quote unquote real, or is it just something that Helen has created in her mind to cope with these things that are going on? Another movie that I think does it really successfully and surprisingly also takes place in Chicago is the Child's Play movies. Because, and I think it also helps too that both of those bad guys aren't necessarily trying to frame people. They're just doing these terrible things and letting them take the fall. Like, she says Candyman did it, she sounds crazy. Someone says Chucky did it, that sounds crazy. So really, if you say this person did it, you're just painting a target on your back, ultimately. And I just think that's great. And while we were talking about Chicago for a hot second, I love how this movie uses the atmosphere to really make Chicago feel like a character in this movie. Uh, I've never seen something with a Chicago atmosphere. And I didn't know that was an aesthetic that I would enjoy, but I really did.
I mean, as far as cities go, Chicago is fairly unique because not only do you have the traditional urban elements, but you also have like that rail system that goes all throughout the city, which they took advantage of in Divergent as well, I believe. So it is
But
fun. Yeah, those movies were terrible. I liked the books though, especially the first two. But yeah, so like in terms of setting something in an American city, I think Chicago is one of the best options that you have.
I don't know, they just did a really good job of making it feel like its own character. A lot of the ways you'll have movies, especially rom-coms, that'll make New York City a character, or yeah, a really good quintessential Hallmark movie will make its quaint little Christmas village sort of its own character. I just like seeing it, and I like that extra work put into it because throughout all horror, you get a lot of locales that really don't feel like their own character. Like there's 12 Friday the 13th movies, and not once does the camp itself really feel like a character in the story. It doesn't really feel like a presence. It really just feels like exactly what it is. They found a location, they put a camera on it, and they started rolling hot teenagers getting killed.
Yeah, that's an element of storytelling that I think a lot of people just forget. I'm not going to try to make any claims about whether it's a consequence of any particular time period. I'm sure that writers all throughout the history of humanity have forgotten about this, but your setting really should feel like its own character. You should be able to look at a depiction of a particular setting and be able to feel the ambience that it creates, and you should be able to take the story out of that setting and put it somewhere else, and it doesn't feel like the same story anymore. And a lot of those that you mentioned, they don't do that. They really are just stories that have a setting because they have to happen somewhere. And yeah, you could have put Candyman in a different location, but if you did, it would have been a different story. And they used Chicago very well, and especially the project elements. Cabrini Green, is that the name of it?
Oh, yeah, and what a beautiful name, too. It just rolls right off the tongue. For some reason, I'm kind of obsessed with that name right now, Cabrini Green. Cabrini Green. The movie does a good job of not painting the people that live there any specific kind of way. Yeah, they have gangs and they have crime, but there are honest, good people that live there. And they're not, and it's not like an overplayed, like heart of gold person. It just feels like a very truthful portrayal of people who are just, that's the situation they're in and they're working their way out of it, like Anne Marie and her baby Anthony, who is the main protagonist in the movie that came out a couple years ago, Candyman, the requel.
Is that the one that Jordan Peele made?
Yes, he produced it. He was supposed to direct it, but I guess he got busy doing something else and he kind of fell out with it. So someone else technically directed it, but he helped write the story and produced it, yes.
Okay, because I know that there was that movie that was made just very recently, and then there were also two Candyman quote unquote sequels, which I haven't seen, and I don't really know anything about them.
I don't, I'm not too sure on those. I know one of them, it takes place in New Orleans, which will be fun to see because I don't live far from there. Um, but I hear they're not as highly reviewed. So far, it's just kind of like a bookend on good reviews. It's this movie, and then it's the one that came out a couple years ago that people tend to like, and it's just a part of that fun Hollywood trend where they completely nix all of the sequels and just do a direct sequel to the original one.
And that's really dicey territory, I think, because a lot of times sequels are awful, and you can get a lot better of a product by just focusing on the original. But in other cases, you're discarding an entire extended universe that a lot of people really enjoyed and cared about. Like the quintessential example would just be Disney with Star Wars. And so I don't know. I feel like that's dangerous territory there when you try to do that. And without having seen the sequels, I'm not sure if I could comment on whether I think it's a good idea or not.
I'm not 100% sure either. But I did want to kind of touch on something that I really love about this film is there is this looming nihilism in the project, uh, and kind of the hopelessness of Helen's mission. I mean, she's wanting to write her thesis paper and do all this, but then she's having dinner with these people who are quote unquote her peers, or more so, in her field, and it's Trevor and this one other guy, and they're just both kind of pious and obnoxious. To where this scene just really more annoyed me than anything else in the movie. But it just kind of does seem like this is the future that she is working so hard for. And in a way, I feel like the character of Helen envies the people Cabrini Green a little bit, because the true, honest, hardworking people, they are living in the now to make now better for the future, whereas she's just working for this future that, as far as the movie depicts it, is just kind of blah and about, I don't know, just kind of shitting on the people that are under you.
Yeah, and a lot of that comes through the character of her colleague slash superior, whose name I have forgotten, and for good reason. But he looks like the king of the druids from Spaceballs, this sort of very meaty looking
Yes.
guy with long frazzled hair. And it's actually through him that we hear the story of Candyman, at least the alleged origin of the myth, which is that he was this gentleman in the 19th century, a black gentleman, and then there was an interracial relationship, etc. He gets his hand cut off and is stung to death by bees, which is a pretty metal origin story. To be fair, like that, I think that's pretty cool. Um,
They
but
kind
this,
of go to extremes with it, because it's they cut off his hand, he gets stung, and then they also set him on fire.
yeah, which plays into the ending of this film. I guess I didn't even realize it, but the scene itself is very forgettable. This dinner scene. And like a lot of the elements in the first half of the film, it doesn't really go anywhere. Like, you have Helen in competition with her colleagues to try to write about Candyman. You have her, of course, wanting to finish her thesis and get her degree. You have even the story in Cabrini Green about the gang leader that is using the story of Candyman to increase his own legend. All of this just completely falls off of the map after we get into the second half. Like, even the character of Jake, this endearing little boy who lives in Cabrini Green and helps Helen, doesn't go anywhere. And I think that's another criticism of this film that I have, is how disconnected the first and the second halves feel, because I wanted to learn more about this gang leader that was impersonating Candyman. It felt like he should have had a bigger role. This colleague that delivers the story of Candyman and with whom Helen is competing, he has no role in the story at all. It just, these things kind of disappear. How did you feel about that? Did that bother you, or do you have any thoughts?
I didn't have. I mean, I get and see what you're saying, but I think the point of the gang was to also instill more of, is this happening? Is this not happening? Because you get a split-second shot of him hitting her with this like meat hook thing in the head, and you see a little bit of blood. One, it also explains where she got said hook from, and also it could explain why she's having these blackouts.
Yeah, but even that scene itself I found to be terribly confusing, because you have this, from their perspective, posh white woman who's coming into their territory and is stirring up trouble. And so they go into this bathroom that she's in and they start harassing her. And then the guy who's impersonating Candyman knocks her in the head with a hook, like you said. And then nothing happens. Like, please, if I missed something, let me know. But it is not explicitly stated that she was robbed, that she was assaulted further, that she was raped, or anything like that. It just seems like these people went into the bathroom, hit her in the head with a hook, and then left. And that seems extremely confusing and anticlimactic. Like, what's even the point of doing that?
Well, it's implied that she got beat up pretty bad by her black eye, but there, don't also forget, there's a scene where they're in the police station. And in the police station, they're doing the lineup, and she points out the guy pretending to be the Candyman. And so he is put away, and apparently he had killed, we have a couple instances of this woman who was killed in her apartment, who, that's the apartment that Helen and her friend go to and first discover kind of the quote unquote Candyman's lair. And also he was the one who killed the little boy that the other little kid is talking about as well. But because it was Cabrini Green, the cops really didn't interfere with it. But it's one of those things where it was an assault on, a white woman, that it created a little bit more buzz, and that they couldn't just wash their hands of it.
Well, exactly, but that just contributes to the problem because if you look at it from the Candyman impersonator's perspective, he has just gone in and assaulted this white woman from a higher class neighborhood. He is inviting trouble onto himself. So why did he go halfway? It feels like you either leave her alone to preserve your own safety or you just kill her. Like why would you just go in there and then beat her with a hook and then leave? Like that doesn't seem to accomplish anything for his character, nor does it accomplish much for the story. I feel like I missed something, or that something was missing.
I mean, I guess I could kind of understand that. There wasn't really any follow through. Now, she was pretending to be a cop at the time, but I don't want to make this character bigger than he is, because he really is. The one scene we see him in is the scene that he is in. And then it just kind of goes away. I think it was mostly to wrap up this whole other people being murdered thing, and it also does enact the Candyman, because this fake Candyman was spreading the legend, and the legend was being stirred. And the whole instance in the parking deck was Candyman saying, "Hey, my followers, they don't really believe in me anymore, and it's your fault, and you're gonna help them believe in me again."
I absolutely agree with you when you say, let's not make this character any bigger than he was, because he really did just appear in 2 scenes and he probably had less than a minute of screen time. So yeah, this was a very minor character, but I think that's my issue is I don't think he should have been a very minor character. In a lot of ways, you could consider him to be the boss of the first half of the movie. Like if this movie were a video game, he would have been the boss of the first level. He is the Candyman gang lord, and all of the people in Cabrini Green are afraid of him, and he is responsible for a lot of these murders. And more importantly, it is his existence and their fear of him that helps to perpetuate the legend of Candyman himself. And it's only after Helen puts this guy away and tells the little boy, hey, Candyman's not real, and people are no longer afraid of this guy, that the real Candyman comes and starts trying to establish himself as a figure of myth. So, in a lot of ways, the entire plot of this movie can be pinned on this gang lord as much as it can be pinned on Helen. And I think that it's disrespectful is not quite the right word, but I'm going to use that word. It's a bit disrespectful to have given him such a small role.
Well, to be fair, they had a lot they had to throw into it. And with a city this size, there are a lot of perspectives and a lot of moving parts. I believe, well, in the Forbidden itself, it's more attributed to they find the gang because um she's doing this work on this graffiti, and Candyman is just like a commonality in the graffiti in the story, and that leads her into more of the urban myth of what is the Candyman, which is a completely different look. Like he has a giant red beard and everything, so they did a complete 180 on what this character was supposed to look like too.
I really think it works though, and I think it's a shame that it's taken us this long into the episode to maybe really start talking about the Candyman as a character, but I think they knocked it out of the park. I mean, first of all, Tony Todd's voice is just phenomenal. I think
It's honey. It's made by the bees.
yes, and it is just this extraordinary mixture of very creepy to the point where to like make the hair on your skin stand up, and also playful and seductive. Like if you were just sitting alone in your home and you heard him calling out your name, you would shit your pants and then ask to hear it again. Like it's just a wonderful juxtaposition. And his design also, like apart from the hook, on his hand, and the bees that are occasionally present, he's just a normal looking guy wearing a relatively nice coat. But he feels a little out of place, like he's in the wrong time, like he's not really there. And I think that's so great. Like, again, compare it to the Freddys and the Jasons and the Michael Myers and whatnot. And this guy is just so collected, so calm, so intelligent, such a real person. And yet he has this air of grandeur about him. A lot of this reminds me of Phantom of the Opera. I don't know if you got any of that.
Oh yeah, and that was apparently Tony Todd's kind of inspiration. He wanted to make his own Phantom of the Opera. And it is apropos because this, for what it is, this movie kind of is almost like a supernatural, I don't want to say a romance, but it's kind of a supernatural seduction, similar to how the Phantom was with Christine Daae. It's very interesting to see. One of my favorite little tidbits of the movie is how we hear Helen and her friend walking in the lot and their footsteps are just clanking up and down the garage. Well, when Tony Todd starts walking, we don't hear footsteps. His footsteps don't make a sound. And I'm pretty sure that was intentional to kind of give him this otherworldliness, as though he's there, but he's also not there.
Oh, that was definitely intentional, and that was a very good detail. Another thing that I really love, and this is probably my favorite thing overall, is the the dialogue, if you want to call it that, maybe even just the monologue, but the things that Candyman says are so poetic and so
I knew you
filled
would
with
love that.
meaning. Yes, like this is just amazing. Like, compare Welcome to Primetime, bitch, to Your death will be a tale to frighten children, to make lovers cling closer in their rapture. Come with me and be immortal. And he talks about, I am the writing on the wall. He talks about, we need to restore the faith of my congregation. Like, this guy, the way he speaks, not only his voice, but the choice of words and the sort of wispy ethereal quality to them, it sounds like he is an apostle of myth more than he even is or was a real person.
And it's very seductive.
I do think, similar to the request that I had, that it be more ambiguous as to whether Helen committed the murders or not, I think that something that would have made this film better is to make it a little less as though Candyman really was a gentleman from the 19th century, and more so as though Candyman was just a story. And the entity that we see in the film is kind of given life entirely by the story. Because the fact that he's obsessed with Helen, which we learn is because she resembles the lover that he had when he was alive, that kind of lends pretty strongly to the idea that Candyman really did exist, and that this is sort of his spirit being prolonged through myth. And I think it would have been a lot cooler if we never know whether he existed or not. Like, he's just an urban legend, he's just a story. He never really existed, but he was brought to life by people's belief in him. And that's why he wants to sustain that belief. I think that would have been a lot cooler.
I've also got to agree with you that his dialogue is just a chef's kiss, period. Um, and I don't really want to mess with him having to say any more or any less, mostly because I've heard him say stuff in the sequels. And while it's not cartoonish, it definitely reads more like a 12-year-old trying to imitate this kind of dialogue.
That's just the worst, isn't it? Like, you're not even, you don't even have the decency to fuck it up completely. You just have to be a pale imitation.
Clive Barker does a really good job of writing these very brooding, dark characters with a very eloquent. In imitation, it doesn't go as well. Now, I will say, what I've heard of the requel, it's a lot better, and they do some of the stuff you're bringing up. They kind of go into in like the trailer and stuff, and it kind of puts some of that into context. And I kind of like the way they went with it.
You talking about the lackluster performance of the sequels has got me imagining Candyman just chasing this scantily clad woman down a dark alleyway and saying something like, "I'll show you a proper hooker, Amy." And just thinking about the horrible places that could have gone.
More or less. I know there is a kill during the Mardi Gras festival, so I'm pretty sure one of those is drunk. Uh, but I do know the guy that was very obnoxious in this one, her superior or whatever, who wrote the Candyman article 10 years prior. He is one of the opening kills in the next movie.
So they are connected then. I mean, I sort of imagine they would just have an entirely new set of characters.
Again, he's just like a cold open thing because I just saw it on one of those like movie scene YouTube things while I was doing some research. And normally I don't like doing like too much research that's more opinion based because it interfere. I don't want it to interfere in my own opinion, but I did do the research just to kind of gauge out there where people stood on what perspective we're supposed to believe in this. Was it all Helen? Was it all Candyman? What kind of happened there? But anyway, basically the cold open is he's written a book about Candyman and Helen, and he's on the book tour. The book actually looks really nice. It's one of those like 90s hardcovers that has the name written in a very his name written in a beautiful font in Candyman, but the slip cover is a mirror, and it's like that reflective kind of tinfoily stuff that they put in a lot of book covers that reflect, so you can see your reflection and say his name 5 times. Pretty interesting.
How did you feel about the pyre scene at the end?
Well, they allude to it. They talk about it's for the they're having like a not a carnival, just like a some sort of a get together, and that's what that was for. So I mean, I buy it. You're gonna have a huge wood pile, and it's gonna be a communal thing, which speaks to at the heart of this movie, as bad as it is. You have all these people who are outsiders, but they're still all kind of together in it, and there is a connection in this community. Whereas from the outside looking in, from Helen's perspective, it's a bad place. Only bad people are there. And even though she marvels that, oh yeah, my apartment was supposed to be in the ghetto too, but it was nice, so they redid it, this and that, and it has the same layout and everything.
There are a couple things about the pyre scene that rubbed me a bit the wrong way. Firstly, I didn't appreciate the Candyman reneging on his deal with Helen, because Helen makes a deal with him that if she goes with him and becomes his victim and whatnot, that he will let the baby boy live, and he completely goes back on that and tries to kill the both of them, which I think weakens his character as a whole, because any character is weakened by being duplicitous unless that is the core element of their character. And I don't think that being duplicitous is the core element of Candyman's character like it would be, say, Peter Baelish. Um, and also, I'm a bit confused by the fact that he was physically harmed in the pyre scene. Like, Helen stabs him with this burning bit of debris, and it actually touches him and hurts him and catches him on fire, which is very confusing because, as you mentioned, they go out of their way to ensure that he doesn't make a sound when he walks through the garage. And when we see the footage in the psychiatric hospital, the Candyman is not visible on the footage, and no one else can see him. So the entirety of the film has made it extremely clear to us that he's not really there. He's just a phantom. And Helen is seeing him in her head, but then she stabs him, and he catches on fire. And it's a sort of quote unquote you defeated the bad guy type scene. And that felt out of place to me. What did you think?
I think it plays into the narrative of this is her internal struggle by her quote unquote killing the Candyman, and her making her presence known in the pyre with the baby, that removes all shadow of a doubt for the people who do believe that the Candyman took the baby. That removes what power he had. So functionally, he is now dead, and now Helen is this boogeyman character to this community.
How would that remove his power though? Because if they know without a doubt that Candyman is the one that took the baby, then they know without a doubt that Candyman is real, and that strengthens his legend. It would strengthen his legend and Helen's, would it not?
In my mind, the way I see it is just the myth of the Candyman was a thing, very low level. Then the guy started doing it, pretending to be the Candyman. And then from there, it became the real Candyman was mad that Helen was pulling focus. And so you still have people out there who believed in the Candyman, but a lot of them just put it on the guy in the gang, such as the little boy who Helen seemed to pretty unwittingly convince that the Candyman wasn't real. Even though he's still a child, he still kind of believes in it. But her showing herself at the pyre with the baby kind of removes the doubt that Candyman did any of these things for the community. Or maybe because she was able to do it, that gave them enough to bury the legend because she was willing to sacrifice her own character to now become this boogeyman, that the community could then let it go and just let her take the fall for all these things and not let it be Candyman and sort of kill the legend. Kind of like they did with the late stage Nightmare on Elm Streets, where if no one believes in him, he has no power.
Yeah, it is a very, very similar concept, the late stage Nightmare on Elm Street, which
I will say, I don't. I think the killing him thing was supposed to be a bit more metaphorical, um, than a literal translation of him, dying. So I think I understand where that confusion is, but that's just my rationale of it.
I could see that that's how I could see that being how it should have been, but at least for me, it came off as very literal and very tangible. Like him being stabbed in that manner and catching on fire. It didn't feel like there was enough of a psychological struggle, you have no power over me type thing. In the build up to it, it felt a lot more just like a physical altercation. And I can also see how maybe the defeat of Candyman at the end, even though it would solidify his existence for the audience, in this case, the audience being the people of Cabrini Green, not the people watching the movie, it would solidify his existence for them, but it would also maybe help to alleviate their fear of him, right? So he has been defeated, he is gone. And so the myth goes from him being a boogeyman to him being defeated. But what's confusing about that is then that kind of paints Helen as a heroic figure, because even though a lot of people in the wider world probably believe that she committed those murders, this community that we've been focusing on for the entire film in Cabrini Green, they don't think that anymore. At least that's the impression that I got. They understand now that it was Candyman. And so that would make her, again, heroic. And yet at the end of the film, she's now this boogeyman, murderous wraith type figure that has taken Candyman's place. And so I think there's a bit of a dissonance there. It doesn't quite fit. Like, is Helen a more heroic figure or more of a villainous figure?
I think more of a heroic figure, just because the way the movie ends at her funeral. And if you want to know how much Helen was liked, only about 4 people showed up to the funeral, and it was out of obligation, it felt like. But then the entire community of Cabrini Green shows up for her, and they even deliver the hook to her.
It reminded me of the entirety of the Hood pulling up to fight the aliens. I
Oh.
I started expecting to see a bunch of like cars and people like pulling out bazookas and handguns and stuff, and the president to show up. That would have been fabulous. But yeah, that's the interpretation that I got too, is like they respected her and they understood the truth of it. But then in the end, we have Helen being this boogeyman slasher, either in Candyman's place or in addition to Candyman. It's not made entirely clear. And she really got the short end of the stick on the naming convention, right? I mean, saying Candyman 5 times fast in a mirror, a hell of a lot more interesting than saying Helen 5 times fast.
Well, I thought Trevor only said it like twice.
No, Trevor was repeating it like the entirety of that scene. He keeps going like, "Oh, Helen, Helen." Like he definitely says it at least 5 times.
Well, you can tell he misses her because, let's be honest, that apartment looked a lot better when she lived there. Which, let me tell you, how mad I was at Trevor. Um, his lady's been in the psych ward for a month, and he's already invited the side piece over, and she's painting the walls. That is disgraceful.
I don't really think so. If you interpret it as she is a side piece in the sense that like he's been having a relationship with her at the same time as being with Helen, then yeah, that's infidelity. You're a dick. But the way that I interpreted it was Helen is obviously a murderer to any sane person. Any sane person with access to this information is going to think that Helen is balls to the walls crazy and is a threat to anyone she comes across. She has killed her best friend. She's killed this woman in the project's dog and kidnapped her baby. And even though Trevor didn't know it at the time, she's killed the doctor that's trying to help for her legal defense. So, like, she's obviously nuts. And if you want companionship, you're entitled to have companionship. They're not together anymore. She's probably going to be put away for life. She's been away for a month. Like, it's completely fine to pursue a new relationship. And a month, to be honest, a month for a guy is a pretty decent turnaround. Because, like, I know girls who will break up with their boyfriend and they'll have a new one the next week, sometimes the next day. So I really didn't feel like Trevor did much of anything wrong.
We've talked about Helen and the evidence against her, but let's talk about Trevor and the evidence against him. So when first we meet Trevor, he is hosting a class that Helen is sitting in on, and it's revealed that they're a married couple, and she sees this student. We don't know her name, but Helen picks up on it because she even makes a point to tell Trevor she could barely look me in the eye, and say my name. And then he's like, oh, she just has a little schoolgirl crush. And then later in the movie, not later in the movie, but after she says Candyman in the mirror 5 times, it's kind of a little fake out that he jumps onto the bed and she's like, where have you been? And he just says, it's late and I'm blitzed, or something like that. Uh, I just couldn't keep up with his antics. And then whenever she's been out of it for a month and she sneaks back into the house, there is that same girl in the house painting the walls. A gross, ugly flamingo pink color.
Yeah, that's not a good color.
And apparently, I interpreted the ending also as Helen was a better cook because she had a nice dinner on the table and there was a well-decorated cake in the background in the little flashback that he was reminiscing on. And there she was talking about making a salad and then just going ham on a skirt steak.
Yeah, so I can see that there is an interpretation of this where Trevor was being unfaithful. And the fact that they are married, which I actually wasn't sure about, does mean that you should probably take a lot more time to mourn Helen's loss.
At least get a divorce.
Yeah, at least get a proper divorce first. So yeah, I get that. That's not entirely appropriate. But it needs to be infidelity in order for his death to be justified. Infidelity, go ahead and kill the person. Totally fine with that. But just having a new partner after your old partner has gone batshit crazy and become a serial killer, that's totally fine. And I think in order for me to feel that Helen's killing of Trevor was justified, apart from the fact that it's just an urban legend. He said her name 5 times. I would need to see clear, irrefutable evidence of the infidelity, and I don't think we got that.
I know because the movie was focused on Helen and Candyman, I feel like it was at least put in there enough to where they make a point of it. Again, with the same girl in the classroom and her making a note of it. And again, it is a very common trope in, for some reason, horror movies on college have a very prominent trope of someone is sleeping with a teacher.
I'm not sure that's just horror movies. That's just almost every college in any movie.
I mean, I'd have to watch it again to get further information, but that's what I gleaned of it, especially because she was already painting walls a month in. I mean, again, you're right. If something like that happens, you're more than welcome to seek another partner and everything, but you're definitely not gonna have them already moved in and painting the walls and redecorating the whole house after just even if he like she gets committed day one, he goes out to a bar and meets her. That's still a little bit off the table.
Well, and this is maybe a separate issue, but she didn't really seem like all that much of a catch either. She seemed kind of bitchy.
I mean, yeah, and that, and she was kind of also giving maybe a younger Helen, if that makes sense. Now this isn't implied in any form or fashion. This is just kind of my headcanon, but I kind of got the feeling that perhaps Helen was a student that Trevor picked up at one point, with her being a grad student, and perhaps they just got married um, to satiate the board and make sure everything was kind of on the level there, because he is visibly much older than she is. And she's well aware of this lecture that he does on urban legends. Even they have an argument about him, he should have done it next semester instead of while she's trying to collect all this data for her thesis. So she's clearly attended this class already.
Either that or he just talks about his curriculum with her. I think you preface this by saying there's no concrete evidence of it, and I think that's true. There isn't. I can certainly see how someone would interpret it that way. And in terms of their age difference, honestly, to me, they just both look really old. Like, I was confused by Helen still being a graduate student. Like,
Oh, yeah.
Trevor, if he didn't age well, which, look, I know some people in their mid 20s that have Trevor's hairline and facial structure. So the dude doesn't actually have to be that old, but he does look kind of old. And so does Helen. Like, I would have placed them, I would have put Helen like early to mid 30s, late 20s at the absolute youngest, and Trevor like mid 30s to early 40s.
I don't know. It's just something that I picked up on, and again, the circumstances are a bit different in the novella, so I couldn't tell you with 100% certainty how this was actually supposed to play. But I feel like giving notice to that does sort of imply that, and does sort of kind of give you a vindication of how much everything how Helen has already lost everything, because she's not really going to be able to finish out her grad degree. Her character is ruined because now she's known as this crazy baby killing, dog slaughtering murderer. And also, her husband, regardless of if he's been faithful or not, has moved on, and in such a way that all her stuff is gone out of the house, and the house is almost unrecognizable to what it was.
Oh yeah, I mean that would be a terrible situation. It's from her perspective, she basically went to sleep, woke back up, and she's been written out of the world. I mean, I don't want to downplay the terrible loss of that experience, but I mean, it's not like it was Trevor's fault, really. I mean, she's dealing with horrible supernatural entities that are trying to frame her for these crimes. And honestly, maybe it's just because of experiences that I've had, some of them fairly recently, but when Trevor was in the bathroom, obviously grieving over Helen, I felt really bad for him because like look at it from his perspective. Let's assume the version of events where he wasn't unfaithful for a sec. He was in a relationship, a married relationship with this woman. They seemed to be pretty happy together. She had a lively personality. She was intelligent. She was cooking for him. And she was pursuing her dreams, and he had a good job at the university. And then just completely out of nowhere, she goes crazy, starts killing random people, starts killing her friend, gets committed to a psychiatric ward. Then it's just like everything falls apart. And it's like, this person that I knew and loved, where did she go? She just completely fell apart and vanished from my life. And you can see that he's really feeling that in the bathroom scene at the end. Like, yeah, he's in a new relationship, and yeah, they've painted the walls this horrible pink color, but he at least is not being callous about it. He really misses her, and he's kind of in shock that all of this has happened.
There's a lot of times whenever grief will just, even if they were a bad person, but you had good memories, you'll sometimes think back on that. I don't know. I just think about the hellish landscape to which he lives now. Because his new girlfriend, who is arguably a Helen type, um, so very much Trevor's type, but younger. He's kind of maybe just seeing that the grass was greener on the other side a bit, because this woman, she's mostly useless, let's say that. The little bit of interaction we got from her, she was very useless in the situation, and it didn't help, of course, that Helen was covered in blood, and what we know she's done, that'd be terrifying enough, but she's making poor choices. I'm not really saying anything against Heather. I'm saying things more against, oh, what's her name? Yeah, that's my stance on it. Just want to note that I thought the scene after the dog's head is cut off, and that whole scene with Vanessa Williams and Helen fighting, the police procedural scene where she's just being searched, that was very jarring to me. Not necessarily jarring, but it was very um true to life and disturbing. I thought that was one of the actors who played Helen's better moments in the film.
Yeah, so at first when you called it jarring, I thought you were going to say maybe that it didn't have a place in the film or whatnot. But yeah, no, it was great, I think, because it helped to solidify that transition from Helen being innocent slash a victim to Helen now being perceived as a criminal and a crazy person. And having us dwell on that, I think, really helped to make that concrete. I felt like what followed, with the cops just being in the room yelling at her, maybe that is realistic according to some people's experiences. Maybe it's not. That seemed a bit extreme to me, where he's like telling her, you have the right to remain silent, and she's trying to explain herself, and the cop is just shouting like, answer the question. That all felt like a little off to me. I don't know.
Was it a bit off? Yeah, but I don't think it'd be necessarily 100% out of character, especially for Chicago PD. And at the time, like, literally every famous serial killer is either from Southern California or Chicago. So they had a lot on their hands, and I just took it more as a no nonsense approach. Because back then, you couldn't have empathy. You just had to go off of facts, and the facts were the cops found her. She had a butcher knife in her hand. No, a meat cleaver. Yeah, a meat cleaver in her hand, covered in blood, and was attacking Vanessa Williams. But that was my one little note. Again, I just want to reiterate how great Tony Todd's his voiceover was, and just his performance as a whole. Everything just came out so melodically. It really helps sell that this is a figure that is just of legend. And I think that's kind of his power too, is he gets to be a legend. So no matter what he does, It's not even going to be in the shadows. It's going to be a figment of a shadow, which I think is very cool. Alright, folks, if you're new to the channel, this is the segment of the show where we decide if a movie is deep or if it should be cut. It's a personal rating system, and usually, I don't know, I don't want to go into explaining this whole mess. Hang on, let me try take two. Alright, folks, if you're new to the channel, new to the show, this is a segment where we decide if we think the movie is deep or if it needs to be cut. Jacob, what's your final verdict on the film?
I think this is probably the most resounding deep that I will give to any film, or at least any of the films that we have reviewed so far. I did have a lot of problems with it. I already discussed them. I think that some of those were explicitly problematic and others were just improvements that could have been made. But for me, like, one of the worst positions a piece of art can be in is just short of greatness. And I think this film was just short of greatness, so that frustrates me. But this was great. I am so glad that we watched this. And the previous episode in which we discussed New Nightmare, I talked about how I have a sort of possessive protectiveness over Freddy as a slasher. Candyman has usurped that immediately, just with this one film. Like, I love his voice is amazing, his speech is amazing, he has such good presence, and he represents something. I mean, he's not just a dude with a knife or a hook or what have you. He represents an idea. He represents stories themselves and the power of stories, and I think that's just so wonderful. So yeah, this is deep. I think that no doubt about it, this is one of the better slasher films that I've seen.
And I think I'm gonna say that I think it's deep as well. I was just a little iffy on the first watch just because, again, my expectations were heavily subverted. I thought I was getting cotton candy, and instead I got well seasoned broccoli. So both are good. It just wasn't what I was expecting. And on the second watch of it, I got a lot more out of it. That having my expectations being firmly set in what this was, I had a great time with it. Um, I really, I really just like how the narrative structure plays out, and as far as its themes of this person who is now on the run from the police and being framed. I thought it played it a lot better than most movies, and I'd honestly say most movies that came after this that involve a supernatural creature where that's trying to frame someone kind of became paler imitations of this. I also like the scenery. I like how they make this uh, grungy Chicago city feel very real and atmospheric in a way that I really haven't felt in a horror movie since Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I really felt like I needed a shower after this guy, just because of all the dirty, grimy settings, and it left me thinking a lot about um, the core messages of the film and what these characters represent in the zeitgeist of horror. All right, folks, thank you so much for listening. That's our show this week. Make sure to join us next week because we're going to take a look at Halloween 3 Season of the Witch for our yearly Halloween special. We're so excited about it, can't wait for you to hear it, and that's going to be dropping earlier next week. So that's going to be dropping on the 30th for you guys to enjoy. Also, if you enjoyed this episode or you enjoy our past episodes and you feel so inclined to do so, make sure you give us a like, subscribe, leave a comment, and make sure to just keep following us as we cover our horror movies. We appreciate you guys. It's really great to give you this content, and hearing your feedback is really important. Other than that, I hope you guys stay spooky.